There's a regular occurrence in our home. There are a lot of things that we have learned to do decently well, and some really basic things that still catch us by surprise. And regularly, it'll be about 5:45 in the evening, and Cassie and I will look at each other and said, "Oh, we have to eat again, don't we?" And we'll start scrambling, trying to figure out how do we get food on the table in the next 15 minutes before people start getting angry and there start being serious problems. There is this relentless thing that happens in life, isn't it? That like somehow you can solve all of today's problems and then you wake up and you do it again the next day, right? Over and over and over again, they just seem to keep coming. And one of the remarkable things about the Gospel of Mark and the gospel as a whole, as you look at the life of Christ, is Jesus entered into those everyday things that people face. It's very easy to picture Jesus as this kind of almost like phantom of a person who all he ever does is stand on mountains like this and talk, right? But like one of the things that the Gospels introduce us to is this person who is very much engaged in real everyday life and meeting real everyday needs of people. And so when we come to this part in Mark chapter 6. We're in a section in the Gospel of Mark. The whole book can basically be divided into two halves. The first half, Mark chapter 1 to 8, is answering one big question, which is, who is Jesus? And all the stories and all the teachings really center on this question of who is Jesus of Nazareth. And then, we'll get here in just a couple of weeks, we'll see there's this pivot that happens near the end of chapter 8, where it turns from the question of who he is to what did he come to do. And the second half of the gospel is all about what Jesus' mission is all about. What did he come to accomplish? So we're in this section in Mark chapter 6 where we're answering the question, who is Jesus? And as we go through our study of Mark, we're skipping over a few sections here and there to get to some big stories. I want to bring you up to speed to what's happened earlier in chapter 6 that we had to pass over. There's this moment in the story where we are told that John the Baptist has died, the cousin of Jesus that served as the prophet that told everybody Jesus is coming. And so Mark kind of rewinds and tells us the story of how we got there. And one of the things that I'm impressed with reading the Gospel of Mark is a master storyteller. Sometimes I can kind of imagine that it kind of feels like thrown together stories, all just kind of crammed together. Mark is a master literary craftsman, and he has put the stories he did together on purpose to draw attention to the things that we need to grasp. You see, the death of John the Baptist, it seems like chronologically happened a little earlier, but Mark finds a way to bring it up here because he wants us to hear this story at this particular moment. He says John the Baptist has died, and then he goes, let me tell you what happened. And so he rewinds to this moment where King Herod is having a big party. And so we read in verse 21, finally the opportune time came. On his birthday, Herod gave a banquet for his high officials and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. So you can picture the scene. This is the king of the northern part of Israel. So Rome rules the entire world practically at this time. But what they would do is they would approve little regional kings that were supposed to keep things in order on Rome's behalf. And they were supposed to keep the empire happy. So Herod is this political conniving person, the son of Herod the Great that we heard about back in the time of the birth of Jesus. And he's ruling in Galilee. And he has gathered a party of all the important people of Galilee, all the rulers, all the military officials. These are the people in charge of the region where Jesus is serving. And he gathers them for this party. And we won't go into all the details of the party, but it says, when the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his dinner guests. If this feels kind of slimy, it should. Okay? If the scene feels weird, that's because it is weird. What's happening is all of these men are having this feast, all these military leaders and the king are having this feast and getting drunk, and he asks his daughter to come in and dance for them. Or his stepdaughter, and she comes in and dances, and he's so impressed, everybody's so excited that he says to her, I'll give you whatever you want. up to half of the kingdom. So this sounds like the raving of a drunk man. He says, I'll give you anything, half the entire kingdom, it's yours. So she goes to her mom and says, what should I get? What should I ask for? And John the Baptist had been preaching against the immorality of Herod and his wife Herodias. And she says, I know what I want. Go tell him you want John the Baptist's head on a platter. So she comes back and she requests that. And that's exactly what he does. In verse 27, as she makes the requests, it says, so immediately he sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. This is the darkness of what Israel's leadership is doing at this time. These gross parties taking place where there's self-indulgence that culminates in the murder of the greatest prophet who ever lived. Now, John describes the feast that Israel's king is serving immediately before he turns to a different kind of feast. Two kinds of leaders for Israel, offering two different kinds of meals. One that served them up the head of a prophet on a platter. Another meal is going to look very, very different. One other thing that's happened to set this story up is a little bit earlier, Jesus gathered his disciples. They've been watching him work, and this is a part of Jesus' strategy. They've been watching him minister for a long time, and he says, okay, now I want you to go do what you've seen me doing. Go into the villages and tell people. And what Jesus' ministry is doing is he is preparing them for what we call Easter. He knows where his life is going, so he's sending his people throughout all the villages to announce the kingdom's coming, the kingdom's coming. All of these spread out parts of Israel, they're making all these announcements. Get ready, get ready, get ready. Because a short while later, he's going to ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He wants them to have heard the announcement so they can watch for it, so they can be prepared when they see their king come. He sent his disciples out in the villages saying, hey, I want you to go to every little stretch you can find and tell people that the kingdom is coming. Their king is here. And so where we pick up our story is in this weird contrast between Herod's party and the disciples going out and announcing there's another king. We then come to them coming back to report to Jesus. So that's what happens in chapter 6, verse 30. It says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. So they're super excited. They're saying, we told everybody all these great things happened, and these crowds are coming. It says then, because so many people were coming and going, they did not even have a chance to eat. He said to them, come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Jesus, being a good shepherd, does exactly what Psalm 23 talks about, right? What's a good shepherd do? He leads people to quiet waters, to green pastures, to rest. Jesus sees they've been working hard, they're overwhelmed, they're busy, it's time for a retreat. Anybody in here need a retreat? Okay, so 5 of you, the rest of you, it's coming. Trust me, you need a retreat, you just don't know it, okay? Jesus recognizes how tired they all are, and he says, you need a retreat. You need to pull away, okay? And so he takes them, and that's a pattern of Jesus over and over again. When things get busy, when things get hard, he knows he needs to retreat. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place, but many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. This scene sounds silly to me. I've tried to picture it until I actually got to go to Israel and stand at the Sea of Galilee. And I don't know about you, but I've always pictured the Sea of Galilee as this just massive, huge thing. It's actually so small that you can stand in one spot. It's a crazy thing to do with your tour guide, to stand in one spot on the shore, and you can see clear to the other side, and they can sit there and just point out, okay, so right there's Capernaum, and right there's Bethsaida, and you can see all the villages. It'd be much more like a cove at Beaver Lake than some massive sea, right? So it makes sense that they would get in the boat to escape, and as comical as the scene is, that the crowd would just run around to the other side of the lake and meet them there. And that's what happens. People aren't picking up on the social cues that Jesus says, goodbye, we're going to go spend some time alone, and they just follow him to the other side. And so they land and there's a large crowd already gathered. And what does Jesus do? It says he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That phrase is a phrase that happens multiple times in the Old Testament to refer to the failure of Israel's leadership. I think Mark brings us this phrase here on purpose after the story of Herod, that he sees these desperate people looking for someone to care for them, for someone to direct them. And Jesus, when he tries to pull away, they don't let him go. They keep chasing him, and he feels compassion. He sees the desperation of their need, and so he starts teaching. He just starts giving them what they need. Now, there's somebody else who had a need though, right? Jesus just recognized that his apostles, his disciples are exhausted. They're tired. They haven't even had time to eat because they've been pouring out so much. What happened to their retreat? What happened to their lovely getaway where they were going to go sit and have some time to be alone? See, the thing that's really comforting about this story to me is I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but I have found in life that so many times, despite all of my best efforts, life's demand won't let you retreat. You can make all the plans. You can plan for a really great Sabbath day. You can plan for a 3-day getaway. You can make the plans to get up early in the morning and have quiet time with the Lord. It's amazing the interruptions that will come. There is this one prayer retreat that is 4 days long that I have been planning to go on for the last 2 years. I've planned to go 3 times, and each time there's been an ER visit and a medical emergency of some kind that has interrupted me going. It's just crazy how it happens, that things just get in the way. And I don't know about you, but sometimes there can be this, as Christians, we have a tendency to create a new legalism every few years, okay? So in the 90s, it was all about purity. In the early 2000s, it was like, are you missional and edgy enough to reach the lost people? And right now, I'm afraid that there's a tinge of a new kind of legalism that says, are you slow and contemplative enough? Now, is purity a good thing? Yes. Is being evangelistic a good thing? Yes. Is taking time to be slow and contemplative with the Lord good? Yes. But sometimes thank you for that. I am so happy right now. But sometimes those good things that are from the Lord, instead of being seen as a gift to fill us up, can become a marker of how holy we are. And we start to measure how good we are based on if we're doing whatever the thing is that Christians are excited about right now. And I've gotten to a point where the next person who tells me to ruthlessly eliminate hurry from my life, I'm going to ruthlessly eliminate them from the conversation, okay? Now, I get it. We are too busy, aren't we? We are people who have filled our lives with distractions and commitments, and it is impossible for us to slow down. That's a problem. And at the same time, some people have some pretty big burdens they're carrying. Sometimes it can feel incredibly heartless to look to the single parent working 2 jobs trying to make it every day and say, man, you just need to slow down. You really need to start carving out an hour every morning to spend with the Lord. Sometimes it can feel shaming to look at the person who's battling a really intense health complication and say, hey, you're just too busy, slow down. So what we do is we play games, don't we? We quit saying I'm busy and we start saying I'm really full right now. Because busy's a sin, but full is good. The reality is we got to tear down this game we play to see how impressive we can be spiritually and start looking to what does God actually want for our lives. And sometimes, despite our best efforts, life's demands chase us, even to the retreat. Now, please, if you hear me saying that we shouldn't try to eliminate busyness and distraction, I'm not saying that. I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm simply acknowledging that sometimes, even when we try to do everything we can to create margin, life gets in the way. So what do we do then? Let's take a look at what happened with Jesus and his disciples. In verse 35, by the time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place and it's already really late. Send the people away. That seems like a reasonable request, doesn't it? I'm done here. Just send them away. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Are you kidding me? 5,000 men alone. Now, we don't know if people debate exactly what that means. It could mean, one possibility is that this is just men, and this gathering has a little bit of a tone of like a military uprising, like it's a bunch of men trying to get Jesus to go take Jerusalem with them, or it could just be counting the heads of households, and this could be 5,000 plus women and children. But somewhere between 5 and, 12,000 people, they've just said you need to send them home, and Jesus says, nah, you should go ahead and provide for them. That is supposed to sound insane. We are supposed to realize that when the disciples' tank is completely empty, when they have nothing left to give, Jesus actually says, okay, so why don't you go do something impossible on an empty tank? And they, like me, are often very slow to pick up on what's happening. Their answer is, how are we going to afford that? We don't have that much money. Very reasonable thinking. And he says, so what do you have? What do you have? And what they have is not enough. They bring the very best of their resources. We got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish to feed several thousand people. This is a joke. They do not have what it's going to take care of these people. So what do they do when they don't have what it takes? Jesus directs them to have all the people sit down in the green grass. They sit down in groups of hundreds and 50s. And taking the 5 loaves of the 2 fish, he broke the loaves. He gave thanks and broke the loaves. He gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. Do you remember how this story began? The disciples had been going so hard, so long, there were so many people, they didn't have time to what? Eat. The story begins with the disciples being hungry and not having what they need. And then we go to thousands of people not having what they need. And Jesus provides for all of them. Says there's so much left over. There's 12 basketfuls of leftover food when it's done. Now there's some symbolism happening here that anyone in Israel at this time would have picked up on. The word a remote place. It says they're going to go to a remote place to get alone, and when the disciples complain and say, Jesus, we're in the middle of nowhere, we're in a remote place. That word remote place is the word desert or wilderness. It's the same Greek word that would have been used to describe where Israel was when they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. The imagery here would have been so thick. You know, as a culture, we have some images that make sense of it to us that even out of context, they immediately trigger something. If I say rockets red glare, you don't need any other context, right? If you've grown up in the States, you recognize the Star-Spangled Banner, and suddenly you have images of Revolutionary War and all that. For a bunch of people living in Israel, if they hear about a large crowd of people hungry in the desert, and one person teaching them and then miraculously feeding them, their mind instantly would go to the story of Moses back in the wilderness with Israel when God provided manna. If Mark chapters 1 to 8 are answering the question, who is Jesus? This story tells us that Jesus is the one who provides for God's people. Just like God fed his people, Israel now feeds the people of God. So what do we do when we are trying to do the thing we know we should do? I know that I need time with the Lord. I know that I need to create space and margin, but I just can't get there. I have this affliction called all or nothing thinking. And the way that tends to work out is I will know what I ought to do. Best case scenario, Nick's life and rhythm would look like an uninterrupted hour every morning. to be still and left alone with a cup of coffee and my Bible and stillness and prayer. And I would get a 24-hour Sabbath every week, and about once every 2 months, I would have like 48 hours to do nothing. But here's the temptation for me. If I don't get best case scenario, my temptation is to throw in the towel and say, well, I get nothing at all. If that beautiful hour-long time with the Lord doesn't happen, if I wake up late and barely get my child to school and I have an appointment, well, it's just cruise on into your day. Ideally, the pattern that we see Jesus mark out through all of his gospel, through all of his life, is that he stopped and pulled away for time with the Lord. That absolutely is the ideal, and we should fight for it. We should fight for rhythms to stop and to be still and to be alone with the Lord. But when the demands of life don't let that happen, we cannot throw in the towel and say, well, I guess I'll just do life on my own now because I don't have my wonderful time alone with the Lord. One of my dear friends, he's a childhood friend I grew up with, and he's now a missionary working in the Middle East, training former Muslim believers to be disciple makers. And he's someone I look up to a ton. And when we had Karis a few years before they had their first kid, and while his wife was pregnant, he was back home in the States raising support, and he came and stayed at our house for a while, and he and I were staying up one night talking, and he was just asking me about parenthood. And I was just walking him through having a small child, an infant, and what all the responsibilities look like, and how you help your wife, and how you care for all that. And as I finished talking about all the responsibilities, he goes, my prayer life is about to grow so much. And I said, did you hear anything I just said? It's like, what about what I just described sounds like you're going to have time to pray? And he said, oh my goodness. He said, Nick, at 2 a.m., when I'm walking my child around and barely conscious, the only thing that's going to keep me sane is if I'm talking to the Lord the whole time. He said, all of those moments of feeding and walking and changing and bathing, those are incredible opportunities to pray. Why would you not pray when you're doing that? Like the time that you're stuck doing something with your hands, that's an awesome time to pray. And I realized I had in my mind that the only way to meet with the Lord and be connected with the Lord was to create this really ideal, perfect space. And by the way, please hear me say it. That is a great goal. That is a great thing to do. But what we cannot do is when that doesn't happen, just give up and think we can do life on our own. I think what Jesus is showing us here is that even when the demands of life crowd out any space for Sabbath, any space to stop, we still need him. When Dr. Mark Bailey, who is my professor in the Gospels, when he told this story, he had us imagine what it would be like. Like, you've got thousands of people. Jesus is breaking bread and handing it to the disciples. How many trips back and forth do you think the disciples had to make? How many times did they have to go, I think we're going to run out this time? And they come back and Jesus just keeps providing. And when he summarized this story, he said he thinks the big idea, the big point to take home is what we need for them, we only find in him. You can fill in the them with whatever that blank looks like in your life. Whatever the demands are that are crushing, beating down on you, that make you feel like you just don't have it in your tank to go on anymore. Whatever you need for the job that is crushing you, that you just don't seem to be able to get ahead on. Whatever you need for the health crisis that is just zapping all of your physical, emotional, and financial resources. Whatever you need for parenting when you just feel like you're failing and you just don't seem to have what your kid needs from you. For that relationship, for that friend that things seem to be falling apart, for that struggle, that idea in your mind that seems to be dominating you that you just can't get relief from. Whatever the demand of life is that is bearing down on you, what Jesus is showing us is that he answers that need. Here he did it with physical bread. But in John's gospel, The same story's told. And after this miracle, people come back to him ready for more bread. Like, hey, do it again, do it again. And I have to imagine, he had to have been so patient. He looks at him and he goes, I'm the bread. He says, I'm the bread of life. It's a metaphor, people. The goal here was not that you keep coming back to Jesus so he can give you a new loaf of bread. You were supposed to learn from the miracle that he is the bread of life. He's the one we need. So keep coming back to him to be filled. What we need for all of them, all of those demands, we only find in him. So don't make the mistake I do. Don't have that all or nothing thinking that says, because I can't have the textbook perfect retreat and quiet time, I guess I just can't connect with God today. A couple years ago, the gas gauge quit working on my car. For those of you who know me, you can probably tell where this story's going. And so I now, if I'm being responsible, need to watch the odometer, how many miles I've gone. I have had several moments in the last couple of years that have embarrassingly ended up with me on the side of the road walking to a gas station. And they charge you an arm and a leg for those little 2-gallon buckets. I don't know if you knew that, but they make a lot of money off people like me. Because for some reason, I have this ridiculous thought in my mind, even though I know I have to just be on fumes, I still think I can make it to this meeting and get gas afterwards. When the demands of life weigh down on you, when I'm overwhelmed by the demands, it is so easy for me to think, you know what? I can get through today. I can get through today and I'll reconnect with the Lord later. I'll look to Jesus for what I need later. Let me just get through this moment. And it always comes out when I get overwhelmed and I'm at the end of my rope. It always comes out in my grouchiness, my grumpiness, my temptation to fall into things that hurt me and others. You cannot run on empty. Jesus is the bread of life. And we need him. So invite him into the moments. Invite him into the overwhelmed. I want to take a moment right now as a group just to be quiet and just to spend some time talking to the Lord. And I got 2 questions that I want us just to spend some time in quiet prayer just to talk to the Lord about. The first one is this. Where are the demands of life overwhelming you right now? Where do you feel like you just don't have your resources? Just like the disciples, when they looked at the crowds and they looked at their resources, they said, what I have is not enough for this demand. Where is what's being demanded of you more than you have the resources to meet? Take a few minutes of silence and just talk to the Lord about it. And now let me ask a follow-up question. How will you deliberately turn to Jesus this week in that area? If every day after school is a meltdown between you and your kid, what would it look like to choose to talk to the Lord during car ride or line before the kid gets in the car? If an interaction with this coworker strains you every week, what would it look like to turn the radio, the podcasts, Spotify off on the drive to work and just spend some time talking to the Lord about that relationship that you know is about to be hard? Make it practical. Make it connect with your week, what you're facing this week, and talk to the Lord about it. How will you invite him into that space? Take some time to to talk to the Lord about that issue.